Aloha and welcome to Hawaiian History Month 2022. We're celebrating the 184th birthday of Queen Liliuokalani. This week, this is a month, but this is the second week, and usually we have 1 week devoted toward Native Hawaiian health and well-being, as seen through the lens of Hawaiian history. So really excited to share today and really grateful to Hawaii Pono'i Coalition for allowing this presentation. The theme is, again, Native Hawaiian health and well-being through the lens of history. And the title of our presentation for this evening, our first presentation, is Iulu no Kalā Ike Kumu, Child-Rearing Traditions Recalled by Native Hawaiian Kūpuna. And I am really thrilled to be introducing just a wonderful Native Hawaiian kauka, a wonderful colleague, a friend, Carol Hi'ilani Titcomb. She's been a community pediatrician for many years. I'm not going to say how many years, but many years. She has practiced pediatrics in a wide range of practices, ranging all the way from an academic Kapiolani Medical Center practice to rural communities, Waimanalo and Waiʻanae, and even experiencing the military medical system. So she has a wide breadth of experience. And she's a proud graduate of UH Manoa, where she got her, not only her undergraduate degree, but her master's in public health and her medical degree. She did her pediatrics residency at Kapiolani. And I always like when I introduce people to give them a chance to say a little bit about themselves, especially to orient themselves to us for their sense of place and even maybe a little bit of her ohana and her mo'oku'auhau. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Carol Hi'ilani Titcomb. She will give us a presentation and hopefully we'll have a nice, robust question and answer session at the end. So aloha, Carol. Mahalo for being here. And I would love to have you introduce yourself and this wonderful work that you've done on this absolutely fascinating topic.
Well, mahalo. I'm more of a student than an expert, but I'm, as Martina said, I'm a pediatrician in the community. And this has just been a subject, a big passion of mine. To learn more about our ways of raising children. And I'm really excited to be able to share them with you tonight. I'll tell a little bit as we go about my motivations. And I feel I'm more of the vessel than the subject tonight. So I'd like to share with you more about what was shared with me by Kūpuna. So I'm going to head to the PowerPoint program. And tonight I want to share with you childhood traditions from Kūpuna. And I've had the great fortune of working with Auntie Pua Burgess, I'm sorry, the second slide, who always challenges me with the question, why did you agree to do this? Whenever our family gathered together, the best thing was to be at the big table with the grown-ups when they began talking story about the old days. As a parent and a pediatrician, I wanted to bring their ways of being into my parenting and into my practice. By the time I got everything in place to conduct interviews, 2 generations had passed. But in this hour, I hope to share with you what was so generously shared with me, the lived experiences of Native Hawaiian individuals who had been born between 1930 and 1945. I invite them, as well as all our Kūpuna, to join us tonight in spirit, that they may continue to inspire us with their mo'olelo. Next slide. In my training at Kapi'olani Medical Center, Native Hawaiian children occupied an excess number of beds in intensive care unit and on the cancer wards. In my practice in Waimanalo and Waianae, Native Hawaiian children experienced higher rates of diabetes, of asthma, of MRSA infections. Our children are disproportionately counted among the roles of youth in foster care and correctional facilities, living in poverty, lacking in resources and the amenities of neighboring communities. I ask you, where are the public pools? Where are the skate parks? Where are the bike paths and sidewalks? How do we account for this? Because make no mistake, an accounting is due, for this is unacceptable. And after 40 years of well-intentioned, targeted interventions, it is unfathomable. Next slide. I ulu no Kalā o ke Kumu. We need to look to the source, to Kūpuna. In a focus group study conducted by Carol Plummer in 2011, Kūpuna across the state of Hawaii identified cultural loss as a priority concern for the well-being of their children. They explained that if we want healthy adults, we need to look at prevention. We need to provide supports for families, build connections to community, and to do so from a Hawaiian cultural framework. Because if cultural loss is a social determinant of health, then reclaiming our culture is a path to healing. Next slide. Social science tells us that when child rearing is proactive and value-driven, children fare well in many measures of well-being, such as those listed: development, social competence, emotional well-being, and wait, what is this telomere length? And this is where the expansive conceptualization of well-being in indigenous approaches and the reductive discipline of Western science, as it hones down into molecular processes, intersect. Next slide. Telomeres are those segments of DNA, parts of our chromosomes, composed of thousands of repetitions of nonsense-based sequences. They cap the ends of our chromosomes the same way that those metal tips cap the ends of our shoelaces, and they protect them both from unraveling. Studies have shown associations between telomere erosion and aging, chronic illness. They've shown associations with stressful experiences such as racial discrimination, harsh parenting, and adverse childhood experiences. Next slide. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, entered our lexicon with a groundbreaking study of about 19,000 members of the Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, conducted by Vincent Felitti. They found that there was a dose-related association between the number of stressful events, which are listed on the left side of this slide, experienced in childhood, and the prevalence of health problems in later life. And here we picture chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which may be seen in smokers, but it also was true for asthma, for diabetes, and for heart attacks. And that is just astounding to think that if we started putting our money into prevention, into raising children, that we would get the payoff in better outcomes for adults. So what do we know about Hawaiian child rearing? Next slide. What little we do know comes from the 19th century writings of John Papa'i'i and David Malo, from seminal descriptions of Polynesian family systems gathered by Mary Kavena Pukui, from anthropologic studies done in Hawaiian homestead communities in the 60s, and they describe customs that differ broadly from American conventions. Child rearing was characterized by indulgent infancy, early independence and interdependence of very young children, the earlier adoption of adult roles by adolescents, and all of this was made possible by the diffusion of responsibilities among multiple caregivers in the mākua generation. Next slide. To this day, the ohana is our major cultural asset, and our elders are a vital resource. Parents look to grandparents, not to doctors, for child rearing information. So I turn to Kūpuna. Their recollections and reflections help us to identify how our culture made such resilient children and cohesive families. Next slide. Advisory groups from community centers in Waiʻanae and Papakolea nominated respected Kūpuna for the study, and I appealed to individuals with leadership roles in Hawaiian civic clubs, ali'i trusts, and homestead communities. In some cases, informants recruited their friends and relatives. And from 2000 to 2011, I sat down with 21 Kūpuna and a digital recorder and asked these 7 questions. What's your name and how were you named? Where did you grow up? How were you raised? What do children need in order to thrive? And what do you consider harmful for children? What's important to preserve as things change? Next slide. As Kawa'a says, I stand in the doorway of my hale looking out, meaning I conducted the interviews, analyzed and organized their data in ways that made sense to me, but there's too much of my voice in this. I sent some excerpts out as a PowerPoint file. The words of our informants appear in this kind of formatting with this banner at the bottom of the slide. I may skim over these passages quickly, hoping that you will wish to revisit them in your own time and at your own pleasure. But I wonder if you will think, what themes float to the surface for you? What is not here? What of your own experiences come to mind? And finally, why should we care about child rearing? Is there anything of meaning for our systems of healthcare and social service? Next slide. We know that place is a foundational aspect of Native Hawaiian identity. So the first question was, where did you grow up? Kūpuna spoke eloquently about a connection that is emotional, spiritual, and genomic to the place where they were born, One Hanau, and where their bones of their ancestors were buried, Kulaiwi. Next slide. I grew up in the mokupuni of Oahu, the moku of Ewa, Ahupua'a of Pu'uloa, in the ili of Ke'ahi. My grandmother never left this area. She was born here, raised here, stayed here until she passed away. She loved it, you know. And people ask me, where is she buried? And I say, none of your business, because as long as nobody goes near it, I'm not saying a word. So far, so good. Kawa'a explains the concept of aina as much more expansive than that of the physical environment. It may be better understood as the whole of creation, and it encompasses the spiritual or metaphysical or relational milieu. Next slide, I'm on rootedness. Mary Oneha described it as a sense of rootedness that is experienced as pu'u honua, a safe harbor, a place to return to when you are in turmoil. And Auntie Betty described it as being piko to a place, connected, just as a fetus is connected to its mama through the umbilical cord. When things are not going through, au kai, go take a bath in the ocean. Release all the pilikia, all the things that may be problems for our household. So I know when something is not right, when my children are not listening, or things are happening, or there is chaos, violence, or they're angry, I say, let's go swimming. Next slide. If rootedness is defining and life affirming for Hawaiians, then being uprooted may be linked to our poor health status. Nature needs to be preserved because our relationship with nature really kind of makes us who we are. So if we lose some of the things that are important in nature in Hawaii, we will lose the things which make us important. Tremendously important is the natural environment. Next slide. Aina is experienced as a living, breathing being, no less a part of the ohana than its human members. And just as relations within ohana are characterized by respect and reciprocity, the relationship to place involves a kuleana expressed in mālama aina, land stewardship, resource conservation. And this was codified in the kapu system that determined who gathered what in which season from where. Next slide. This area was known as House of the Seaweed. It used to come up to my knees. Now lucky you find any. Lots of people, instead of just picking the top, they pull the whole thing out. We never went get plenty. We just go get what you need and that's it. So many of our participants gathered fish from the ocean and la'al from the mountains. Respect was shown by taking only what was necessary to survive, and they were appalled by overfishing. Next slide. At the root of the word aina is I, and the topic of aipono, a balanced and proper diet, came up readily and repeatedly in interviews, despite there having been no questions pertaining to infant feeding or family nutrition. We learned that the act of feeding is symbolic of caregiving. The infant is fed living tissue, vaiu, from the mama's breast, and then poi from the umeke. Next slide. Tutu would give me dry fish, poi, not plenty, only so much. Then she would go out and get some more. I know my tutu mama and tutu papa, they never gave me food where you eat and eat and eat. You eat only so much, whatever they give, and that was sufficient. Because when you overeat, you get sick. So many spoke of the importance of eating wholesome foods that sustained them, and of doing so in a manner that was sustainable, never gathering more than you could consume, eating to survive, never to excess. Next slide. In particular, when we eat poi, the first weaning food after breast milk, the favored staple across our lifespan, we hearken back to our creation mythology. We invite our elder haloa, nakalao, kapalili to the table. Some interpret this as the placenta for the first human, the younger brother haloa, the progenitor of all humankind. So when we share poi, we invoke the genealogic relationship between Kanaka and Kalo, between Kanaka and Aina. And Oha, the corm of the Kalo plant, is the root of the word Ohana, family. There is a degree of reverence when I consume Kalo due to its spiritual significance. Next slide. At the trunk of the plant is what represents the Kūpuna, from which all the branches, all the keiki grow. They embodied the core values of nurturing, mālama, of love, aloha. 4 of our 21 participants were orphaned and raised by their grandparents. A 5th was given in Hanai to her grandparents, but most spoke of unconditional love as the basis of the relationship between grandparent and grandchild. Next slide. The concept of the Hawaiian child being kamale, the gift of heaven, the lei that is given to you. The baby puts their arms around your neck, and that is your lei. A lei is a gift. A lei is something you take responsibility for and not simply possession of. Children were much desired, accounting for larger family sizes, and my informants had up to 12 siblings. Next slide. Family life was characterized by intimacy. Many slept with their grandparents, sharing the same mat. They worked and played, and most importantly, prayed together. My grandparents lived in a grass shack, one where we slept nice and clean with a moena. When it was time to go to bed, I lay down. I'd hear my tutu mama and tutu papa talking about the day's activities, and tutu mama would talk about me and the kolohe things we did, you know, and I'd laugh until it was time for me to go to sleep. Next slide. Many ate from the same umeke in the center of the table. Once uncovered, one was not allowed to argue because of the presence of ancestors. Sharing poi from the calabash is akin to the act of communion, symbolizing again that there are more than one way to feed or nurture a child, nutritionally, certainly, but also emotionally, spiritually, culturally. Did you eat out of the same poi bowl? Many of my generation did. I rather suspect your generation never did. Next slide. Always spend time with your children together as a family. I like to see parents with their children. I think that is more important than anything else because it starts from the house, just like the tree from the root, and the kids are the branches. And there are several references to Iulu no Kalā, like Kumu, among the interviews and among responses from different presentations from Kūpuna. Next slide. Our informants expressed concern over the lack of intimacy today, feeling very strongly that parents should be involved in the lives of their children, that it was their duty to set a foundation for the child. And this is such a contrast to the American perspective, which stresses self-expression, self-determination, choices. The world is so busy that they don't even have time to spend with their children. Hurry up, get your things ready. How are they going to know who they are if, as a mother or as a father, you don't talk to them, you don't share with them what you want them to become? Next slide. Children were an ever-present feature of the adult world. They were not sheltered, and they participated, even if peripherally, in virtually every aspect of adult life from birth, as here, when our informant talks about her father asking her to put on the water, fix the bed, and bathe your mother as she was going into labor because he was on his way home from work. Next slide. To death. And us children, if our mothers went to church, we sat outside. If they had women's meetings, we played out in the yard. If they went to dress the dead, we stayed outside. Wherever our mothers went, we went. We were always involved in our lives. Next slide. And just as the practice of mālama is an expression of aloha, so the practice of mālama, nurturing, caregiving, is an expression of interpersonal love. Our participants were taught as young children to look after their even younger siblings, as Auntie Betty said, as your privilege, not your punishment. My mom had 10 children altogether, so that meant I had to get up every morning and make 10 cups of tea with one tea bag, go down the line and make tea for each one. I would make lunches, 20 pieces of toast, 2 for each of the kids, 1 piece of bologna, or 1 piece luncheon meat is all we could afford. And then we would sit on the porch from the oldest one going down, passing it down the line. Next slide. Caregiving was so intrinsically rewarding that it extended beyond the household into the extended family, as here, where their household, even if there were only 11 from that family, often had 20 children in the home. Children that my mother brought home from the hospital to raise. Our house was always filled with children, never empty. 1 bathroom in the house with 20-something people. And because I was the baby, somebody's combing your hair, somebody's checking your clothes. Ah, come here, let me put on your shoes for you. It was amazing how wonderful it was. I miss those things. Next slide. To the greater community. My mom and dad were Pied Pipers to lost people. At night, there were 4 of us for a long time, and then they adopted my brother during the war. So we used to joke because we'd go to bed, there might be 4 of us. In the morning when we woke up, there's 6, there's 8. But you know, that's the way we grew up. Next slide. Caregiving was reciprocated when our elders became feeble with age. I asked my son, would you like to come to Honolulu and take care of Tutu? He said, oh, I'd love it. He came and stayed with her the whole time. The stories they tell are just priceless. She was not able to bathe herself. He did. He carried her to the bathroom. He carried her to the bed. And at night, he would curl up next to her and they would talk. So Tutu said to me, I used to do that for him, and he's doing it for me. Next slide. Interactions within Ohana were characterized by reciprocity, mutual sharing, mutual caring. It was not a tit for tat. It was a way of seeing yourself in relation to the whole fabric, and it resulted in strong social support networks for its members. I give my cousin a ride to the store, and while at the store, my cousin buys some items for our grandmother. Our grandmother is home watching my brother's children or planning to wash my car when I return home. No one person is paying back another, and yet the support and help cycle within the family. Next slide. Reciprocal interaction on a community level is a way to provide for your family. My dad, I call him a procurer. He said, you want to learn how to fix cards? He don't know, but he knew people that could teach us, and he would bring them over to the house. And while they teach us, he always wanted fish for us. So he bought a boat for one of his friends who was a fisherman. And he'd tell him, the boat is for you. When my wife wants this kind of fish, you bring them. My dad was the type of guy who would look around and say, okay, this is what my family need. Doesn't necessarily mean I gotta provide it, but I help other people. Next slide. Independence and interdependence may seem at odds with one another. However, the goal of Hawaiian upbringing is to produce self-reliant individuals with the skills to ensure the survival and success of the whole group. My father had a great influence on me. You take care of your family, and in order to take care of your family, you take care of yourself first. Or you gotta work as a group, but you gotta stand alone. It sounds like a dichotomy, but it's not. In other words, you gotta excel if you wanna pull your family along. Otherwise, you're a burden on somebody. He was teaching me how to be a man. Next slide. The next grouping had to do with responses to questions of name and genealogy, and had in common the theme of kuleana, role or responsibility. Kūpuna provided examples of a variety of naming practices that have been described in the literature. Next slide. Some were given inoa kupuna, names passed down from grandparent to grandchild for generations, and the namesake may take on some of the mana or social capital of that ancestor, but in return would assume the kuleana of honoring that person's memory. Auntie Betty Jenkins shared how name sharing with her grandmother helped illuminate her destiny. My mother told me from the very beginning it was my grandmother's name, and it meant that I was going to be favored in the heavens. Well, that sounded good. I didn't think too much about it, frankly. But changes began to happen for me, and I kept asking my mother, tell me about my name. And she'd tell me the same thing. But before she passed on, I said to her, you know, I've been asking you about my name. I really need to know what it means. And she explained that I had a responsibility because of my name. So I said, but you know, what you just described, that's what I do. That's who I am. And she said, I know. And I said, well, wouldn't it have been easier for me if you had told me a long time ago? Why didn't you? And she said, because you are not yet ready. It reveals to me how the old folks thought. Next slide. The family name might indicate kuleana of the family within the greater community. The family name could also be interpreted as a spreading of the light. And because we're all teachers, we like to think it means the dissemination of knowledge. That's the way we've taken it in our family, because by actual count, in the last 3 generations, there are more than 600 years of teaching, coaching, and counseling by us. Next slide. One Kūpuna used this in working with at-risk youth. Uncle Ish Stagner said we had a responsibility to know the origins of our name, the story of our family, and he prompts us to reflect on such knowledge informs us about our own purpose. One of the first things I do is when I meet a young person and they have a Hawaiian name, I would say, "Oh my goodness, that's a famous name. Do you know what the family story is about that name?" And sometimes the kids look at me, "I think it just means this." And I say, no, it's a shortened version of a much longer name that stood for when this family did this important thing at this point in history of the islands. And they go, "Oh, really?" And I go, "Yeah. So, what are you going to do as far as that name is concerned? I'm telling you now because you have a responsibility to your name." Next slide. A full understanding of one's kuleana necessitates knowing one's mo'oku auhau. Kūpuna knew that energy flows from one generation to the next, that choices in this lifetime reflect back upon one's ancestors and reverberate in the future with one's descendants. You can reach through the piko po'o, the fontanelle, and call forth an army of Kūpuna to give you guidance. You can reach through the piko Maʻi, the genitalia, and call upon generations unborn to give you purpose. Next slide. If aloha was associated with Kūpuna, kuleana was associated with mākua. Their role was to ensure the survival and success of next generations by providing food and shelter, by imparting essential knowledge and competencies, by promoting spiritual and moral development. They laid the foundation of what we should do, why we do it, who we do it with. We had certain rules and you never questioned it. Hawaiian society was described as very structured and very stable. There was an order. You knew who was the boss. There were rules, and rules represent an investment in children, just as kapu represent an investment in aina. America is a pluralistic society based on individual freedoms and self-determination, and chafes against rules and regulations. How do we reconcile that dichotomy in our younger generations? Next slide. Attachment relationships are emotional bonds between people that serve a biological function. They promote growth, immune function, emotional regulation in a child. They serve the well-being of the family and the community at large. In traditional Hawaiian society, the attachment between child and parent was collectively experienced by the generation of mākua, rather than by any one couple for any one child. This ensured many hands and many eyes to provide affection, supervision, instruction, and yes, discipline for children. Next slide. Mākua were foremost providers. Life was not easy, and they exhibited pa'ahana, working long and hard to keep a roof over their heads. Many, if not most of our participants grew up poor. They all remarked with admiration and gratitude of their parents' work ethic. Always had one person in charge, and that was my auntie. She's the one who took care of all of us. If she didn't, we would all be put in an orphanage. She kept all her sister's kids, watched them, raised them, made sure they ate. She worked as a taxi driver to make money for us. What she says goes no matter what, because it was her hard work that kept us together. Next slide. Children were modeled pa'ahana by their parents, and they learned by doing in their daily chores. They were encouraged to become self-reliant so they wouldn't become a burden to others. You had to get up like 4 or 5 in the morning. You ate your breakfast, and at the crack of dawn, you were working in the taro patch. By 8 or 9, it started getting hot, but by that time, you were through. My sisters-in-law are very fortunate because my brothers can take care of their own children, change their diapers, feed them, bathe them, and get them ready for bed. Besides cleaning, they wash clothes, cook, because they were taught that by my mom. Next slide. Several of our participants reported that they accompanied their parents and grandparents to work, learning adult roles and skills. I'd help him clean up the park, and when we were done, he'd take me fishing. Next slide. Some contributed to household income in significant ways. You still see families selling Lālā on the side of the road. I remember 9, 10 years old, I had to go sell paper. I had a corner. My other 3 brothers had different corners. Well, they would get rid of all their paper and then they would come help me. That's the money we collect. First thing we do, turn it over to Dad. We had no allowance. Dad needed to take care of the household. So the value of working I was taught when I was very young. Next slide. Many Kūpuna commented on the fanatical cleanliness, Maʻi of their mākua. Another thing is that my mom was an excellent housekeeper, just excellent. She was always cleaning. I mean, clean, 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 like 24/7. Our house was immaculate. Next slide. They were very fussy. When the grandchildren came, they never kissed them on the mouth, always on the top of the baby's head. When asked why, well, our mouths are dirty. They knew in their own way how to avoid illness. Have you any idea how hard it was to get doctors simply to wash their hands between performing autopsies and examining patients? The Cry in the Covenant is a story of Ignaz Semmelweis, who in 1850 was persecuted to the point of madness for declaring that doctors were themselves the vectors of disease. And yet our ancestors understood the life-preserving function of hygiene. Next slide. Children were admonished to bathe carefully and were even inspected top to bottom to ensure that they had complied. If I took a bath, they always check, see everything's clean, check my nails, and always, always, always told me, "A'ole kapulu," make sure down by vavai, all the way up clean. All right, tutu, and I gotta show the feet under the knees. Next slide. The fastidiousness could be observed in how food was prepared. My mother was an excellent cook. There are some foods I will not eat because it wasn't made by a mother, and I know the care she put into it. Like, for instance, raw fish, never a bone in it, not a single bone. She was just particular about stuff like this. My grandmother told me that people would judge me by my bowl of poi. And of course, at that time, I thought she was just being fussy. But now I understand she was right, because if one took care in how you prepare poi, you would be careful not to put your negative energies or any germs into the food that you're sharing with your family. Next slide. This was demonstrated in the meticulous feather work of this respondent's grandmother. As I got to be 3 or 4 years old, I have to work feather lay. These take years to make, you know. I only go 1 row across because I was young. Tutu was already older. She cannot see. Oh, I pau tutu, I give to her. She'd feel, oh, wait, no ho'ie. Oh, take it off. I'd say, Tutu, it's all right. And she'd say, no, anytime you do anything, you do it right the first time. And sure enough, I still have those lei, so I know what my tutu said is right. Over and over, Kūpuna recalled how they were exhorted not just to work hard, but to strive for excellence, po'okela, to do everything to their best ability, for it was in achieving individual mastery that every member of the ohana could contribute in a meaningful way to the welfare of the group. Next slide. Children who were always underfoot in the adult world were expected to look, to listen, and learn, and they developed into acute observers who could listen to what was not being said. Next slide. The phrase "pay attention" came up in many interviews. By observing and emulating adults, children were equipped to handle the rigors and the risks of the real world, which for them was the ocean and the mountains. There's consequences when you don't pay attention, when you don't listen to the elders. They're not going to drill it into you. They're going to tell you one time, and you better pick it up. This time of year, don't go over there. What? They're not going to tell you again. And it was a very unforgiving world. If you make a mistake, you drown. If you're walking up Waimea Canyon looking for gold and you don't pay attention, you fall, you die. Next slide. My father had his own description, which could be summed up as "no ask questions." And this is his recollection of my grandfather pictured here. By the time I was 6 years old, I knew better than to ask my father any questions. It was always better and safer to let him do the talking. He'd tell you what he had in mind, like "bring the net" or "get my spear." And it might not be more definite than that. And the fact that we owned over 100 nets, all kinds of nets, and several spears, each of which was made and designed for a certain fish, a certain beach, certain tide, and whatnot, didn't make any difference. You still didn't ask him which net or spear he wanted. That was a question. And you didn't ask questions. What you did was try to figure out which net or spear he had in mind. You knew there were nets for sandy beaches, nets for rock bottoms, nets for clear or salt water, nets for muddy waters. There were moai nets, veke nets, kalā nets, and nets for various other fishes. So you figured it out. You knew where you were. You knew the kind of fish that usually ran there, and you knew what kind of net you needed to catch that particular fish at that particular beach. You wouldn't, for example, fetch a net that was made to catch veke at Maʻi Beach when you were loading up a boat in Pearl City Canal. The water was muddy there. There weren't any saltwater fish there. So you pulled out the 650-foot net that was dyed brown and was the right net for mullet and barracuda. That was common sense. That's what you used when your father told you to go get the net. Next slide. Many teachings were given metaphorically as mo'olelo, within which there were layer upon layer of kauna or deeper meaning to be discovered at different stages of life. Mo'olelo were never explained. Kūpuna knew that the child would take from the telling what was needed when he or she was ready for it. I listened to everything. No subject was taboo. They would say, "Never mind, you'll find out when you're older." They didn't try to hide things. If it was not for children's ears, it was soon forgotten. Next slide. Descriptions of discipline varied from interview to interview. One Kūpuna described her grandparents as soft-spoken people who used nothing more than gentle remonstration and explanations. "Don't talk loud, Ole. We don't do that to you, so you don't talk loud." They never screamed at me. My tutu papa would come, put his arms around me and talk to me, and then, "Oh, hele ana oi ikawa'a. Let's go for a canoe ride." Next slide. My parents, I've got to give them credit for this. They never swore, never. I never grew up in an environment where they were mean to or cussed each other. A bad word for us was to say, "Shut up." And if my mother heard us say that, she would come and put chili pepper in our mouth. That was punishment. Some parents taught with a mere glance. As Auntie Betty said, my mother had a look that could just fry your egg. But she also described corporal punishment. A child might get pulled by the ear for not listening, flicked on the lips for speaking sassy, whacked with a palume ni ao, coconut rib broom, for misbehavior. Traditionally, there was the prohibition against striking the po'o because that's where your mākua sit, or the na'au because that is the site of intelligence. Some spoke, however, of dirty lickings, but it's not clear to me whether this was a traditional practice or an indicator of internalized colonialism. I never heard my mother say, I love you, but she said it with a stick. Next slide. Some have reported that corporal punishment was preferred to verbal reprimand because words have an emotional residue that can be corrosive. There's power within the word, the countenance of life, the countenance of death. Next slide. Others reported that the old folks took care not to humiliate. They never called names. They never demeaned or nagged. You can have them listen to you without yelling, putting them down, but by encouraging, being positive, making sure that what you say has worth to it. Sometimes I hear parents telling kids, oh, you stupid kid. It bothers me. My parents never told us that. Next slide. An experiential learning style relies on modeling, and mākua had to be good role models. As Kūpuna said, they were the best examples. We learned respect because my father always talked properly to my mother, to my next door neighbor. If you're exposed to it, it's easy for you to learn respect. We always paid respect to my mother by telling her, thank you for a delicious meal. The food was ono. That's how we learned respect. Next slide. It was especially important to respect one's elders. It was such a big thing in our day to respect our elders. They always ate first. Now we're saying, oh, the children should go first. Next slide. Kūpuna commented upon the lack of mutual respect between parents and children today. Children need to have good and strong parents, not parents that will argue and allow their children to argue and nag and cry and stomp their feet and slam the door. That's what parents do today, a lot of them. They act just like the child. Next slide. Underlying all of this was the importance of a spiritual foundation, ho'omana. The prefix ho'o is causative, to make happen. Mana is a concept of profound depth and complexity, and ancestors were always mindful of the mana in all things. It is not the same as religion, which is institutionalized. Our ancestors were inclusive, and when the temple walls were brought down, they held on to the old spiritualism while embracing new faiths, believing that all knowledge does not come from one house. Many Kūpuna regularly attended services in different houses of worship. Ho'omana was to be found in almost all aspects of Hawaiian culture and life. Next slide. Whether they practiced traditional beliefs or attended church, our respondents felt that children needed to have a spiritual life, and this was modeled in oli, in pule, in protocol, in prayer. It elevates the mundane, the noa, to the sacred, the kapu. It focuses attention on the task at hand. Here again, that concept of mindfulness, intentionality. So you know there were things that they wanted me to do. They taught me how to oli, when to oli. We do oli every morning. We took a bath and pule before we had our dinner. And after we were done, we would sit down and have scriptures. Next slide. If mākua are the models of core Hawaiian values, who modeled hard and skillful work, proper conduct, hana kupono, and personal cleanliness, maʻi, the importance of a spiritual foundation, it is worthwhile to reflect upon those values. For as Auntie Betty says, these things whisper to us who we are. The Hawaiian values that are espoused, there's a standard list. Pono is on there, lokahi, aloha. The list is not wrong for what's on it, but for what is not on it. How did they get here? Koa, courage. Ike, knowledge. A'a, daring. Ho'okupu, innovation. How did they relate to each other? Oratory, protocol. How did they live? Pa'ahana. Why is ho'okuku, competition, or lanakila, winning, not on the list? In Makahiki, they're so competitive they might kill each other. You want to be Hawaiian? Po'okela, excel. We must preserve for our people values that arm them to be successful in the future. Aloha is not at the top of my list. Other survival values are. Next slide. Last, I asked them, what is important to preserve for our children as we move forward? Next slide. Kūpuna reported cultural suppression, being punished for speaking their native language, for practicing hula, for observing protocol. Before school was finished, the teacher reminded the class, when you go home, don't speak Hawaiian, speak English only. Next slide. Accordingly, many of their parents made the conscious decision not to transmit their culture so that their children could succeed in the new world. My father was not one to share a lot of his Hawaiian knowledge. When we asked, he always said, it wasn't our business, just leave it alone. My parents spoke fluent Hawaiian, but we were taught that we had to speak English. Many regretted the loss of language. This is tragic, for when you lose the language, you lose your identity. Hawaiians today speak the missionary language, a literal type of Hawaiian. The riddle is gone. This is tragic, for when you lose the language, you lose your identity. Next slide. Many realized they had internalized negative messages about being Hawaiian, and they made a conscious decision to reconnect with their culture, to be actively involved in cultural activities for their families and within their communities. I was ashamed to be Hawaiian. We were put down. Oh, you Kanaka are so stupid, lazy, good for nothing. And it does something to you. Of course, when I learned our culture, I've come to know how excellent our people were. All of a sudden, the light comes on and it changes your whole life. I'm a changed woman. I'm so proud to be Hawaiian. Next slide. They spoke of a responsibility to their ancestors in observing traditions for the future generations, in ensuring that these traditions are passed on. And I believe that's why they agreed to share their stories with me and with us. We want to preserve our language. That's important, our culture. Whatever you've learned that is good, pass it on to the next person. Share it with them because it will help in the future. When I do, I say, well, Tutu, wherever you are, I hope that what I did, you'll feel good about what I did. Next slide. So the challenge they pose to us in their words is, what are you going to do? And that is really what I wanted to focus on in the remaining minutes. 200 years ago, we were a robust race that adhered to strict spiritual and personal hygiene. Our ancestors valued industry, innovation, and excellence. We had demonstrably superior knowledge and skill in navigation and medicine, sophisticated systems of irrigation, cultivation, and aquaculture. We enjoyed nutritious and abundant foods. You want to talk about natural? We had pristine air and water. You want to talk about wholesome? We lived in stable communities that valued cooperation. Our children were loved and cared for. We were a successful civilization of some 800,000 persons. And yet, none of that protected us against microbes that ravaged our people, resulting in a 90% population collapse. Nor were they a bulwark against the overwhelming force of a foreign power intent upon parlaying our bodies and our land into profit. For better or for worse, we straddle two worlds. What path we take that integrates our traditional ways of knowing and being with Western science and technology, and how do Kupuna's words guide us forward? Next slide. In the beginning was the word. So we need to reclaim our language using both English and Hawaiian when we have programs. Mana leo is the term for a native speaker, and for me, it conveys that image of the parent feeding a child pre-masticated food, and it signifies nourishment of our soul. Next slide. We must reclaim our stories, our history. Any health program must be grounded in a clear-eyed knowledge of our history and the impact of historical events on our people. Does the family you're working with have a story? Is there a kuleana, a tradition in their past? Were they healers, guardians, practitioners, warriors? A way to uncover meaning, to give purpose, to build connection and a sense of worth is to develop a family story. Next slide. What if the family doesn't know their story, or if the story is not a good one? Then we can empower them to retell the story, to redefine their future, to flip the narrative, ho'okahuli. They knew nothing of their genealogy, their family, their iwi. What canoe did they come from? They didn't know that. And knowing that they did not know, they said, well, we got to start today. Our canoe starts here then. And I kind of liked that approach. And I wanted to introduce that here at Mayor Wright Housing, to have them develop their sense of place, sense of history, and sense of community. Arthur Ashe was reported to have said, start where you are, use what you've got, do what you can. And in that spirit, we need to start looking at our stories. Next slide. We need preventive services. Interventions need to start before conception. And a shining example is the prenatal program you heard about, I believe, last night, Kalā hui o ka po. Far more than teaching traditional birthing practice, this program prepares men and women for the mākua role. It changes the mindset. Next slide. Through a process of self-assessment, building awareness, intention, agency within the couple. It's the very first step in proactive, self-conscious parenting to explore your partnership and your expectations of each other and of the parental roles, to talk about how you deal with stress, to figure out how you're going to navigate the inevitable conflicts, to develop communication skills. This is so important. Next slide. In the Trajectories of Health study at Waianae Coast and Waimanalo Health Centers, expectant mothers mapped their mo'oku au hau. No mere exercise this, for when we included family patterns of diet and disease in the genealogy mapping, some participants were literally able to draw connections they had never noted between lifestyle practices and illness patterns in their family. They came to see themselves as agents of change, and they became motivated to make lifestyle change to address perceived threats to their children's health. This is proactive, intentional parenting, putting a healer in every home. Next slide. We combine this with a culturally modified eco-map called Pohai Ke Aloha. It's a qualitative drawing of relationships, and it enables a couple to take stock of their connections. Where are your sources of support? Are there other assets, such as your work, surfing, hula, hiking? Where are the bonds threatened, broken, lost? Where is the hihia in your family? And is the anticipated birth an opportunity to repair those connections? It enables providers to make referrals for services that might be needed, to make connections to cultural programs and community assets for the couple. And this is akin to kukulu kumuhana in Ho'oponopono, which is an inventory that serves to marshal resources, build connections, and identify needs. Next slide. We must look first within the family for traditions and knowledge. Several kupuna reported that their fathers or their husbands delivered their babies. One kupuna described his grandmother as a gifted palekiki. Some families still practice ho'oponopono. And here, a kupuna recalled practices having to do with the ceremonial burial of the piko and ieve, the remnants of the umbilical connection between mother and child, as a way to figuratively root the new member of the family to his one hanao and his ohana. There are kukui trees, special ones, and since I have grandsons, I buried the ieve with ku fish, ulua, papio. I have a new grandson, and this next full moon that's coming up, we're going to bury his afterbirth there. Next slide. As the plant takes root, so too will the child. With my family, they wrap it up in the la'i and then put it in the niu, bury it. And Tutu would say, this will help you to grow. You have to understand that you don't just sit, you're going to spread out. Whatever you have, share it with people because it will help not only you, but the children that will be coming, your children. And I'd laugh at her because I was young, not knowing that when I get older, it will affect my children and it'll affect their children and on. Next slide. This means, of course, that we have to stop seeing a child as existing somehow separate from the extended family. Interventions need to be family-based, not targeted to individuals. Fathers, grandparents, step-parents, aunties and uncles, domestic partners, invite them, include them, and weave a social safety net for the family, especially the elders who need to be engaged as the sources of cultural knowledge. And consider, how are you going to navigate instances in which a grandparent may be seen as usurping the parental role, stepping in and taking over, and you sense resentment from the parent? Next slide. In our prenatal program, we asked parents to compose a Meleiseā, a name chant for the first birthday. It might be a story or a song. And while this truly was a tradition for ali'i, this helped parents to reflect on their core values, their vision for their child, to see themselves as the first teacher, to lay that foundation for success. We're asking parents to pay attention, to be mindful and intentional. Next slide. In our clinic, as part of our teen screening, we ask each child, what is your name? Who named you? And what does it mean? Auntie Pua Burgess wrote, ask them how they will weave this vision into every aspect of their lives so that every child may arrive at a place where they can say, I'm valuable and I have something worthwhile to contribute to my community. It is the responsibility of parents to teach the significance of the name, for children will eventually walk away from their most sacred inheritance if meaning is not established in terms they can relate to and sustain. Next slide. Interventions must be place-based, teaching your children to know their homeland as a source of support, a place of refuge. If well-being is inextricably linked to place, what then happens with urban migration when you grew up in town, but your people are from Maui? Next slide. Then you lay down roots where you are. Families can learn how to find information that is encoded in place names from oral traditions, from literary sources. They can learn the landmarks and the legends of their community. They can pass these on to their children. Seek opportunities for land-based cultural programs, working on pahonu restoration, or with limu hui, working in a lo'i or local ia. Next slide. Cultural classes are a way to strengthen family. People flock to the board and stone classes introduced by Earl Kava'a, seeking to learn how to make a papa and pohaku ku'iai, the board and stone implements for poi pounding. But in the process, they form connections to family, to community, and to culture, and to spirit. Next slide. At Waimanalo Health Center, we piloted the PICO program of culturally based group well baby care. Here's our psychologist, Dr. Noiʻina Pereira, teaching parents how to pound ulu and kalo poi, again, demonstrating that there are more than one ways to feed a child, engaging all the interrelated dimensions of well-being. Next slide. If families are about intimacy, spending time together, having close physical contact, then sharing sleeping mats and umeke poi, working, playing, and praying together. What if there's a history of trauma and intimacy has not always been positive? We can teach that physical intimacy can be restorative, healing, and safe. It's not always hurtful. Here, our cultural healing director is teaching a parent how to use lomi to soothe a colicky infant. She teaches that you never break contact with the child. Your hand is always on the child as you move around. Next slide. Last, first, and always, ho'omana. Everything begins and ends with spirit. It's in our DNA. Gatherings should open and close with protocol. Parents are encouraged to learn and lead family pule. Next slide. In closing, that statistical Hawaiian described in the beginning of this talk, what image comes to mind? Bottom of the list in every category that you want to be at the top of the list in every category you want to be at the bottom of? That's not what it means to be Hawaiian. I believe that in order to change the behavior of our people, we have to redefine what is Hawaiian. We can ho'ohuli, we can flip that script. Next slide. The prototype for me is a young male, physically fit, powerfully built, slender, genealogy tattooed on his leg or his arm, the javelin thrower. And before he gets up, he's calling down the gods. Come, stand with me. He's chanting his genealogy because he's not throwing alone. Before he throws, he awakens the javelin. Leikuluwaimaka flies up to the highest heights. We have to resurrect these sorts of things. Next slide. If we are to rebuild a beloved nation, we must restore culture. And child rearing is not a bad place to start. I'm so grateful to my parents who did their level best to build a strong foundation. And I'm thankful to those who so generously shared their mo'olelo with me. What a fine and sturdy koko they have woven for us. Mahalo ia oko. And thank you for all of you for listening.
Mahalo nui, Dr. Titcomb. Wow, what an amazing, powerful presentation. Thank you so much for embarking on this work. I know it took many, many hours. So appreciate so appreciate the Kūpuna that we're willing to share with you. And so many valuable lessons for us, for our community. I was writing down take-home notes, and my list is going on to 2 pages. I know that you were really wanting to get a little bit of feedback from the audience. So I wanted to just give folks a minute or two if there were any questions, if anybody picked up any additional themes that maybe that weren't identified. So just want to, maybe we'll check the chat and see if there are any questions that have come up at this time. I see a lot of wonderful mahalos. Yeah, and throughout your presentation, there's just been some amazing feedback. I think this is very powerful. I'm so glad this is being recorded, because I have a feeling that it's going to be watched by many, many more people than we're here tonight, as the word spreads about this wonderful work and this treasure trove of information that you shared with us. So I'm not seeing any questions right now. I know for I know for me there was so much. I mean, so many take-home points. Just real quickly. I mean, only take what you need with respect to resources. That whole role of dependence and independence in our keiki, and when was the time for independence and when was the time for dependence, and also the importance of the extended family, and not just the extended family, but the community, that everybody was involved. There were multiple teachers, there were multiple people looking after your children. You mentioned even multiple people keeping them in line. And that's something, you know, with our sort of our Western nuclear system, we really, and people moving away from ohana, we really kind of lose that. It's hard to, that's so important. And so even if we're away, we need to find a way to build that community, because our kids so need it. The impact of our family stories, knowing our stories, our genealogy, the origins of our names, so powerful. And really it's that connection to our ancestors, and that taps into that important role of spirituality, which you said everything begins and ends with that spirituality. That was for our Kūpuna, and I think really very relevant for us today as well. And then also the lessons that the Kūpuna shared about how to learn, right? It was about observation. That was like key. It was like not so much like you asking a lot of questions. It was like learning and watching and observing, and definitely something that resonated with me, that, you know, we need to really be much more aware, and out of that we actually are watching our parents and our Kūpuna role model some of these important things, these values. And then you talked about values. One of the Kūpuna talked about, yeah, there's our standard values that everybody talks about, but what about these other really important values that had to do with excelling and working hard, and I would love to see some of those values added to all these posters and things that we see now. Survival values, I think, is what you called it. And obviously the kuleana to preserve our culture, and that the world is different now. We really straddle 2 worlds, and all of us, we need to have a foot in both worlds, as we work to preserve our culture and to bring back some of these traditions and practices to our hana. Thank you for those wonderful examples with the hapai, the pregnancy, traditional childbirthing, stone, and the board classes. There's so many people in our community that are bringing back traditional practices around lo'ikalo, taro, loka'i'a, our fish ponds. We need to get our families out there, exposed to it, working in the back, in the land, touching the water, touching the earth. So much I got from this. I wanted to do a quick summary, but I think I talked too long because I was so excited about what you shared. So I'm hoping I'm sharing some of how everybody else felt about this, and you can just see some wonderful, wonderful comments. Hopefully we'll save the chat and share them with you so you can have a chance to observe that. So I know we're running out of time. We have another wonderful presentation coming up. So those of you that can stay, please stay for our next session. I have a couple mahalos that I need to share, so I'm gonna see if any of them pop up on my screen here. But first of all, just to Hawaii Pono'i Coalition for presenting this and really keeping Hawaiian History Month going in its current format. You know, we started having to go by Zoom during COVID, and now we're back to part Zoom, part in person. But I think there's always going to be a role for this Zoom because we can reach so many people. I noticed there were people from other countries, certainly other states. So mahalo nui to let me see, Lemaile, can you pop up the mahalo slide, please? Yeah. I wanted to make sure that we mahalo
Aloha, it should
our
be
key sponsors. And maybe we're having a little problem with that. Here we go. Sorry. I really have to acknowledge these people that have all contributed a lot to Hawaiian History Month, not only with people and ideas and sponsorship and finances. So Kamehameha Schools, Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, Papa'ololokahi, University of Hawaii at Manoa John A. Burns School of Medicine, Department of Native Hawaiian Health, Ahui o Nakauka, Association of Native Hawaiian Physicians, Center for Biographical Research at Manoa, Hawaii Nui Akea, School of Hawaiian Knowledge, Manoa, Department of Theater and Dance, Hawaii Youth Opera Chorus, Olelo Community Media, and OEV TV. We also quick thank you to many other people that have partnered with us. You can see them on the screen. And what I'd like to do at this point is turn over the moderating to a dear friend and colleague, Kim Ku'ule Burney, who has the honor of introducing our next really exciting session. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo nui, Martina, Dr. Kamaka. Mahalo nui to, definitely mahalo nui to Dr. Carol Hi'ilani Titcomb, my friend Hi'ilani. What a wonderful presentation, and really grateful that Dr. Titcomb has agreed to share this information. I truly believe it's something that we should share widely as much as possible. We have a part 2 to this evening. So welcome to the second part of tonight's presentation on Ho'ola Week, during Hawaiian History Month. This series, I think many of you know, features Hawaiian health and well-being through the lens of history. Hawaiian History Month is presented by Hawaii Pono'i Coalition. This new season is presented with the support of many sponsors and many partners, and you saw some of them listed with Dr. Kamaka just now. Tonight's episode is entitled He Noiʻina Maʻi, a medical pedigree of the Hawaiian monarchy from historical Hawaiian language accounts, not just newspapers, but others as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our 2 presenters. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed, and it will be archived. All of our recordings will be archived on the Hawaiian History Month website. If you have any comments, please, or questions, please put them in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom, or if you're viewing this on Facebook, please put in comments, and we are scanning constantly, and the presenters will have a chance to see your comments and answer your questions. Now, tonight, these 2 panelists are familiar to this audience, to the Hawaiian History Month, and to anybody who has followed the He Noiʻina Maʻi series with Papa'ololokahi. I'd like to introduce to you Kahikino o Kalā Domingo and Sage Leikuluwaimaka Meleiseā. I'm very proud to present them to you again. They are our archive assistants at Papa'ololokahi. They keep our library in the office organized and up to date and make it accessible to all of us in the house. And they are also in the process of scanning thousands of documents that Papa'ololokahi is in the process of building a Native Hawaiian health archive. And we've got a pretty solid foundation, but it's going to take time to get that repository up and running. But we fully expect expect we will, and we'll launch it, and it'll be available to all of you. And it's all because of the work of Kalā and Leikuluwaimaka. But their specialty is really presenting information from Hawaiian language resources. So without any more delay, may I turn this forum over to Kalā and Leikuluwaimaka. Aloha nui kako.
Velina mai ke aloha, mai ka piina Kalā puka I hae hae. A velona aku, I ka mole olu o le hua. Mai ka piko kuahiwi o mauna kea, me ona mau hoa o wei au, lili noi, poli ahu. O lako mā, a hiki loa aku. I nā one kaulana o ka kui hewa. A hoi aku, ke aloha, I nei nei, ia oko I ke anaina, na hoa makamaka. Na hoa aloha, na Kūpuna, na keiki, ke anaina e anaina mai nei, velina mai ke aloha ia oko pakahi a pau. Aloha everybody, my name is Kaikino Kalā Domingo.
Aloha kako o keia o Leikuluwaimaka, Meleiseā.
And as Auntie Kim mentioned earlier, mahalo for that beautiful introduction. We are the archive assistants representing Papololokahi today. And we are also
We're also Hawaiian language graduate students. Malalo kahalo aloha Hawai'i, kwai ilani. So mahalo to our Kumu there for instilling in us and really equipping us with powers and tools to be able to do research like this.
And we just wanted to begin with a disclaimer. Medical pedigree, that does not mean we are medical professionals by any means. We are researchers and historians, archivists by trade, not medical experts. So please excuse us if we say in anything in regards to that. And we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. And with that, we recently have heard in this past week the news of a passing of one of today's monarchs, Queen Elizabeth II. And I think that is quite relevant to our presentation today, because not only because our ali'i were very fond of the Britain monarchy and actually modeled much of their kingdom after the British kingdom, but there are certain things and certain symbols that happen when a great ali'i or a monarch passes away and leaves the kingdom to the next heir. And I think it's important that we recognize them and we come to learn them and to respect and to honor them in any way that we can.
To start off, we wanted to recap over the resources that we utilize to conduct this research for the presentation, starting off with, we always like to start off with looking at Papololokahi's Hawaiian Health Timeline and Events, which was first compiled in 1998 by Dr. Kekoni Blaisdell and recently updated in 2016. And then, of course, we have this substantial work, Ruling Chiefs of Hawaii, first written by Sami Manaya Kalani Kamako, one of Hawaii's foremost scholars on Hawaiian history, and then later translated into English. It was first a series of newspaper articles called Kumu Hawaii, and then made available in this English translation.
And next we have our Papakilo database. Running out of OHA's amazing website. A lot of you, any of you who do research out there, you know this website well and use it daily. But it is a great source for researching not only Hawaiian language newspapers, but lots and lots of other things. So please check that out. And a lot of cross-referencing from Ruling Chiefs actually names which day and which month it was published. So it's good to refer back from the actual Ruling Chiefs publication in English to the newspaper that corresponds with it in Hawaiian. And we also have Komo'olelo Hawaii, which is the compiled into 2 books done amazingly by Avaya Ulu. They compiled chronologically all of Kamaka's articles about Kamehameha and all the way through the reign of Kauikeaoli. It's really good because they added okinas and kakos, whereas Kamaka's originally is published without. So it increases our understanding of certain things, certain terms or information that is obscure. We can refer to that as well. And to begin, you see here's our mo'okuoho of the royal family and the monarchy. But today we are only going to go over those who are monarchs, starting off with the first ali'i to unite our islands, Ka'iwa Kilo Moku Pai'ea, known by many names, but Kamehameha. He was born in 1736 in Kapa'akai Kokuiki, Kohala, and he passed away in the month of May 1819 in Kamakahonu, Kailua, Hawaii. And something that I would like to point out that will be important as we look through each ali'i is certain major events that happened in their life that may or may not could have contributed to their health and to the way that they passed on or passed on their genetics to their descendants and others. And in Kamehameha's life, it was the arrival of foreigners, and with them, new customs and also new diseases that were foreign to Hawaii in isolation for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, as well as in the ending of his life, the change of the societal structure from the old religion to the new one, from the old political structure of ali'i to kind of a absolute and then a constitutional monarchy, later on. So keep that in mind as we talk about Kamehameha.
According to Kamehameha, Pai'ea was 83 years old when he died. The last 23 years of his life spent uniting Hawaii under one kingdom, one rule, and then also his years on his reign over Hawaiian kingdom. His cause of death is said to be from natural causes of old age because he lived to be so old, although there are talk in the Hawaiian newspapers about his kahu being concerned because Kamehameha, of course, had so many enemies, lots of people. His kahuna mentioned perhaps he was prayed to death by other people, but it is mentioned that he passed on the 14th of the Hawaiian month, Ka'elo, and then the moon phase of that time was Hoku, according to the Hawaiian moon calendar of Oahu particularly, because we know that other islands actually have different versions of the moon calendar. So this is specifically Oahu's moon calendar. Because he passed in the night of Hoku, one of his daughters was named Leleiā Hoku. And so we know we're more familiar with William Pitt Leleiā Hoku right here, one of Nalani Eha. So Leleiā Hoku was actually named after this Kūpuna, Leleiā Hoku, which means departure or fleeing on the night of Hoku, which is to commemorate Kamehameha Pai'ea, one of their main Kūpuna, his death.
And we'll continue on with this thing that Noke Kuma Kena, or the lamenting for a chief. Not only for chiefs, but some, if not all of these practices were also practiced throughout Hawaii during the time of grief of a loved one and their passing. But for ali'i, one that was specific to them was something called moipu'u, which translates roughly to somebody who would lay with you in your death. And because Kamehameha was so beloved, many wished and they threw themselves at the chance to be buried and to die with their beloved mo'i in the afterlife, although Kamehameha wished that no one be buried with him so that they would be able to take care of Liholiho, his son, the new king of the islands. And kuma kena is the word that we use for general grievances and the practice, the mindset that Hawaiians use when they're in time of grief, such as the kanikau, or the chant of laments or dirges, which were very frequently published in the Hawaiian language newspapers, but they were like a chant that recalled the time that you spent with the loved one who passed away, etc., etc. And also, finally, something that is important to note for Kamehameha is the ainoa. When a chief like Kamehameha so high passes away, all of the religious laws would fall and would be freed, and certain things that could not happen in the reign of Kamehameha were going on at that time. Like women could enter the temples, or chiefs could mate with commoners, etc., etc., etc. But this is important to note that when we move on to Liholiho, his son, that we'll see that it is not reinstated.
We want to highlight, although Maʻi o Ku'u was not the cause of death for Kamehameha Pai'ea, he did contract this disease or sickness. So Maʻi o Ku'u roughly is thought to be cholera. In 1804, Hawaii did have a cholera epidemic, and many of Kamehameha's counselors, people in his aloali'i, his warrior, half of his army actually passed away because of Maʻi o Kuʻu. Maʻi o Kuʻu was also referred to as Maʻi poʻokole because it was said that your hair would fall out due to this disease. And then you'd be poʻokole, or your head would be barren. Maʻi o Kuʻu actually had a very high fatality rate. So the fact that Kamehameha contracted Maʻi o Kuʻu but actually survived it, was one of the very few that survived it, kind of represented to the Lahui, or to everyone under him, that the strength and the endurance that Kamehameha really had in him.
And now continuing on, we go from Kamehameha to his eldest son from Keopuolani, Kamehameha Elua Liholiho. And he made his famed trip to London that many know about, just about a year after his mother Keopuolani passed away in Lahaina the year before 1823. And on this trip, he sought to learn the customs and the ways of London. And before he left, he actually told Kauikeaoli, his younger brother, that the kingdom would be his should he not come back. When he arrived in London, he was hosted and welcomed by King George IV, the reigning monarch of Britain at that time, and he was hosted very well, shown around and seen all kinds of things that he has not seen before, the theater of London, etc., etc. Although on their stop to London in Brazil, it is perhaps thought that they contracted measles on their way to London, and when shortly after they arrived, he, along with his wife Kamamalu or Kamehamalu, fell ill with the disease. King George IV then sent his best doctors to care for Kamamalu, and she passed away on the 8th of July in the year of 1824.
So what's really interesting about Liholiho's trip to London, or trip around the world really, because they stopped some places before England, was that Keopuolani, or his mother, one of Kamehameha's wives, actually passed away in September. And then September of 1823, and then Liholiho and Kamamalu take their journey in November. So only a few months later, after Keopuolani's passing, Liholiho goes on this endeavor and departure to go around the world and kind of start advocating for Hawaii and making these connections with foreign countries. Because the Hawaiian language newspapers does not start publishing newspapers until 1834, so 10 years after Liholiho and Kamamalu's death, that was actually Kalama Hawaii out of Lahaina Luna Seminary. We wanted to look through the London Times to see what they were reporting on their deaths, since that's where their death took place. They're the first monarchs to die outside of Hawaii. The London Times reported mostly on Liholiho's death, but not actually too much on Kamamalu's death. So they only started reporting about Kamamalu's passing when Liholiho passed away 5 days after her. Within Hawaiian Mo'olelo, within our Hawaiian newspapers, it said that Liholiho passed away 5 days after Kamamalu, but the London Times tells a tale that after Kamamalu passes away from measles, her body lays in state in the same room that Liholiho was staying in so that he could mourn and be with his beloved. And so they said that she was staying there for 7 days, and then Liholiho passes. Something interesting is that King George provides them the best of the best coffin materials. It's made out of lead, all the hardwoods of the time, and then everything is wrapped in silk and the finest linens, and the coffins are coated in velvet. And then he offers them to lay in rest at St. Martin's in the Field, known today, or the St. Martin's Church. So as soon as Kamamalu passed away, Boki and Liliha are two that are accompanying these ali'i on their journey to England. And so Liliha was actually the person who took care of Kamamalu. As soon as she passed, she started taking care of the body. And Kamamalu is then taken to lay in state at St. Martin's until news can reach Hawaii that their ali'i have passed. It's not thought that Liholiho was going to stay here too, but when he soon passes later, Liholiho is also taken to stay at St. Martin's in the Field. And news actually didn't reach Hawaii that they had passed away until September. So they passed away in July, and then in September, they finally get word that their ali'i passed away. And then it's all actually not until May of the following year in 1825 that their bodies finally return home. So almost for that whole year, Liho Liho and Kumamalu stay in St. Martin's in the Field.
And also, because they passed away in July and the news didn't reach Hawaii, until September, Hawaiians actually didn't know that their ali'i passed away. However, that there was reported in the month of July in Hawaii that there was a great storm right at the same time that Kamamalu and Liho Liho passed away. Great storms with really torrential rains, lightning, thunder, very high tide and high surf, kind of indicating that something might have happened to their ali'i. And I think that the ones who were in the know, especially the Aloha ali'i who were still remaining in Hawaii, had known that their king and queen had passed away months, even almost a year before their bodies actually returned to Hawaii.
And then they end up returning to Hawaii on the HMS Blonde in May of 1825. And so after Liho Liho Kamehameha the Hawaiian kingdom turns over to Kamehameha Ekolu, Kauikeauli.
He was born in March or August, it's contested, in the year of 1813 at Keauhou, Kona'akau, Hawaii on the Big Island. And there is a story about his birth that he was actually stillborn. However, his kahu, one of his kahu, who was a very close confidant of his mother, prayed him back to life, and he actually then became to live as the longest reigning monarch of the kingdom at almost 30 years. And eventually, over his long reign, he passed away on the 16th of December, 1854, at his home, Hoʻihoʻikea.
It was thought that the king was very sickly leading up until the days of his death. So his wife, Kalā, wanted to take him home to where he was born in Keauhou, Kona'akau. And so they take this trip to Kona, and it said that he pola, he recovers, his health is in such better state. Things are looking really good for the future, bright for the future. So after he kind of recovers, he decides, okay, now it's time to go back to Oahu, go back home, get everything in order and take care of business. So when they come back home to Oahu, there's a party thrown for him, of course, to welcome the ali'i back home. And Kalā actually warns him, according to this account from Kamakalo, Kalā warns him, no, don't go to the party. You just got better. Maybe you should stay home. He shortly returns from the party, and that's when he's feeling sick again. Shortly after his return from the party, he passes away from ma'ihuki, or convulsions. Kalā took him out into the yard or the area that was named Hoʻihoʻikea at the first haleali'i ilani, and that's where he passes away at Hoʻihoʻikea on the month of Hina Ia Ele, the Hawaiian month, the night huna, and it's the 11th day of that month in 1854. Hoʻihoʻikea was actually named after La Hoʻihoʻiea. Kamehameha Ekolu is known for the phrase "O Maoke o Ka'aina Kupono," coined when our sovereignty was restored and returned from Great Britain. And so Hoʻihoʻikea, his hale outside of Haleali'i Iolani, was actually named to commemorate this event. And that ends up being his place of death. And then here in the middle, where it says Kamehameha Ekolu, that's actually what was engraved on his nameplate on his coffin when they buried him. With Kauikeauli's passing starts this tradition of draping the haleali'i in black cloth. So this tradition carried on all the way into Lili'uokalani and the new Iolani Palace, which stands today.
And after Kauikeauli passes away, the kingdom now goes on to Alexander Iolani Liholiho Kamehameha IV. He was born in 1834, and he passed away at the age of 29 in 1863 from asthma. And it was said that during his lifetime, asthma became a problem over the course of his life, and he was often taken to stay up in Nu'uanu, where the air was very cool and it was pleasant for his breathing and his condition. And He eventually ended up passing away just about a year after his son, Kahakuo Hawaii.
Like we said, we wanted to highlight monarchs, and although Kahakuo Hawaii, known as the Prince of Hawaii, didn't live long enough to inherit the kingdom, we just wanted to highlight that he died a year before his dad at the age of 4 from brain fever, appendicitis. And so many of us who know Queen Emma as today Kalā, after the passing of her son, Kahakuo Hawaii, she gains the name Kalā. So Ka just meaning the first chief who passed, or a singular one. After Alexander Liholiho passes, then her name changes to what we know her today, Kalā, meaning plural chiefs who passed away, or the departure of multiple chiefs. So this photo we have here is of Emma in mourning, looking at both portraits of her lani, her chiefs, Kahakuo Hawaii hanging on the wall, and the one she's looking at lying flat is Alexander Liholiho.
And continuing on, after Alexander Liholiho Kamehameha passes on, the kingdom now falls to his brother, Kamehameha Elima Lota Kapuaiwa, who was born on December 11th, 1830 in Honolulu.
And he actually passed away on his 42nd birthday, December 11th, 1872. It said that all of Honolulu was getting ready to come to this grand royal birthday ball for the ali'i, but unfortunately he was already feeling sick. He passes away from dropsy, or today known as edema, and asphyxia. So there was also known to be an abscess that got infected. So he had that bleeding out, and then he had edema, so water and fluid collecting in cavities within him. And here ends the reign of the Kamehamehas. On the newspaper article you see here, something interesting to note is what Hawaii adopted from Victorian tradition is these black lines that border the column in the newspapers. So what this represents to the people who's reading, they automatically know that this is a sign of mourning. So when you receive a newspaper and it's printed with all these black lines, it's to note that somebody very important passed away. So whenever any ali'i passes away, this is how you immediately know. You look at the newspaper, you see these black outlines. It's wahala ke kahi mea.
And something I want to say too about the black border is that one good example is Keopuolani, who died on the island of Maui in Lahaina, and people in Oahu, they wouldn't be able to find out until later. So in the future, when this black border type of thing was implemented, the people on the other islands would probably find out via the newspaper before, because they're not actually there to witness and hear the audible and very loud, as described in many Nupepa, the kanikau of all the different people who are there when they find the news of the ali'i.
What's also interesting is that starting from Kamehameha Eha, Alexander Liholiho, and then continuing on to Kamehameha Elima Lota, the government sponsors and has this budget to provide the community, to provide the lahui with funeral attire. So anyone and everyone are allowed to come to the haleali'i, and they would be given either material for them to make, black material to make or sew their own funeral attire, or given just plain black suits. And then that was what the lahui continued to wear to funerals. So I thought this was something really interesting because it was something that the government provided. There's accounts on the newspapers that state that when Alexander Lunaliho died, they estimated that approximately 4,000 funeral suits were given away from the haleali'i. And then this actually continues in Kamehameha Elima's passing as well. Well, here ends the reign of the Kamehamehas. Lunalilo becomes the first elected monarch of Hawaii.
He was born in the year of 1835, and he passed away in the year of 1874, just 1 year after he was elected to become the monarch of Hawaii. Although in this article on the left, it says Kamake ana o Lunalilo, he was surrounded by his fellow ali'i and family, Keali'i Pauahi, Keali'i Ke'elikolani, along with others. And actually in this same article, Kamake ana o Lunalilo, it also says that he was about 42 years old, and some contest that he could actually be 39 years old. And there's kind of a debate about that. But actually, the next monarch who takes the throne after Lunalilo, Kalakaua, many were actually already starting to petition and to push for him to become the next mo'i. So you see here on the bottom, Ho'okahi wale no mea kupono oyo Kalakaua. I think the best person to replace him is Kalakaua. After Lunalilo's death of alcoholism in Ha'imoipo. And to transition, Kalakaua does indeed become the next monarch. He famously is known to have ran against Emma Kalaleonalani in a vote to become the next monarch. And there was a great divide between the Emmaites and the Kalakauans, as they would call it. And if you would like to learn more, you can hear it. You can go and research about the story of Halekauila Courthouse.
So Kalakaua, born in 1836 and passes away on 2:33 p.m. January 20th, 1891. And he was the third monarch outside of Liholiho, Meleiseā, and Kamamalu to pass away outside of Hawaii. This trip to San Francisco, the reason why he was in San Francisco, it was said that it was a secret trip that he took, and it was actually to petition the Bayonet Constitution. So people didn't really know why the king was going to San Francisco. It was kind of, Kalakaua was already known to be a traveler. He made his global tour, his circumference the world in 1891 or 1881, so 10 years prior to this. So it wasn't uncommon for him to be on trips, but this trip particularly was to attest and petition the Bayonet Constitution. He falls ill and returns to the Palace Hotel, and that's where he later shortly passes away. What's really sad to us is that, like Liholiho and Kamamalu, Hawaii doesn't know that their ali'i passes away. So he passes away on January 20th, and the first report in the newspapers of his passing isn't actually until January 28th. So a whole week and one day later, that's when Hawaii is learning Wahala Keali'i.
And something important to note, like Kamehameha, there are a lot of things that happened in his life. And as Leikuluwaimaka mentioned, that the Bayonet Constitution was one thing, that historical event that took place in his life. And he was also known as the Merry Monarch. And what that means is he had a trend of smoking and drinking. And as you'll see in the next slide, I'll explain. This person, John McDermott, says that this could be a big contributor to his condition. So this article at the top here, The Last Illness and Disease of Hawaii's King Kalakaua, written by John McDermott, Dita Kupchoi, and Anthony Guerrero, is to me, I think, a very interesting article. And I wish they would do this for more people, but they decided to actually examine and do a historical analysis, or as they call it, a historical CPC, or a critical pathological conference, which is a meeting of different medical professionals to examine historical evidence of the death of somebody, in this case Kalakaua, and they try to define in modern medical terms exactly what happened to them and to maybe update their diagnosis. So back in 1891, when Kalakaua passed away, according to a report by Dr. George Wood, who was a US naval surgeon at the time that America provided to Kalakaua to kind of care for him, diagnose him, and to be with him at the end of his life. And Dr. Wood actually writes and takes copious notes and does a really comprehensive report of the final days of Kalakaua. And when he finally passes away, he names his cause of death as Bright's disease, which in the 19th century was when you get diagnosed from Bright's disease, the purpose was so that they could differentiate the treatment between a heart condition and Bright's disease, which was a kidney condition. And also with the Bright's disease was the uremic blood poisoning. And according to Dr. Wood, Kalakaua in his final days wasn't urinating as much as he should be. And what he what he kind of concluded from that is that the toxins usually expelled from the body during urination was actually staying inside of Kalākaʻa's system and was going to his brain, causing convulsions, all kinds of delusions, and contributing even more to his condition. So this team of 3 people end up updating Kalākaʻa's diagnosis, and they call it end-stage renal disease with metabolic encephalopathy. And what they say was that because all of these different contributing factors in Kalākaʻa's life, perhaps his stress, his high blood pressure, he had heart disease because of his heavy tobacco use, he had liver scarring because of his excessive alcohol use, and his kidney disease. But something that I think I really liked in the article is that they say how they would actually treat Kalākaʻa in modern medicine today. And what they say is that they would actually do a kidney dialysis for his kidney condition. They would prescribe medicine for his cardiovascular disease, and they would do diet counseling to see if they could take preventative action so that Kalākaʻa wouldn't use as much tobacco, alcohol, etc., etc. And something else in relation to medical pedigrees that is really interesting in this article is that they say that because of all this evidence of Kalākaʻa's condition, they say that they notice a trend that they have the Kalākaʻas have a family history of immune disorders relating to streptococcal infections, which is also known as rheumatic fever, which was a very, very big killer of the Hawaiian population in the 19th century. Who also fell ill was Leikuluwaimaka, as we mentioned earlier, and also ilani, Leikuluwaimaka being his brother and ilani his niece, from the same kind of condition of rheumatic fever. So we see here, that's why I mentioned earlier that I wish that there were more articles, more historical CPCs done for the earlier li'i, so that we could get more information similar to this, and we could make an even more comprehensive medical pedigree of them. But for now, we just have to take a look at the literature and the historical accounts in order to get this type of information. So.
And then after Kalākaʻa's reign is Liliʻuokalani, his sister, takes over the Hawaiian kingdom. She passes away on 8:30 Sunday morning, November 11th, 1917 at Washington Place, her home on Beretania Street. She was 79 years, 2 months, and 8 days old. It's thought to be that her cause of death were after effects of a stroke. It said that she was thought to be on her deathbed for a long time, for over a month. And it was kind of a situation that was every single day they thought, okay, maybe this will be the day that the li'i passes. And she just lived a lot longer than the doctors and everyone thought she would live. With Liliʻuokalani's passing, again, we see all these black outlined newspaper columns, but we really see the love that the lahui, that the community have for the ali'i. With Lili'u's passing ends the monarchy of the Hawaiian kingdom. Of course, we have Kuhio afterwards. But we see this make'e ali'i, this dedication. Today, we don't really, at least personally, we don't have these personal relationships to our ali'i. Looking at these stories, looking at their funeral stories, looking at their obituaries, their kaniko, you see the love that people had for them. Even if they didn't personally know them, there were so many people that didn't ever personally meet the ali'i, especially people that lived countryside, people that weren't living on Oahu, even people that weren't living with access to Honolulu. They may not have ever met the ali'i in their life, but time and time again, every single time an ali'i passes away, you see the stories of all of the island crying and all of the island coming into this kumakena, which was talked about earlier, death customs or lamentation customs had. And so with this concludes our presentation of the mo'okuauhau. And if there are any questions, we would love to answer them.
And well, we just wanted to close off before we go to questions that we like to say this after every time we do one of these presentations about heavy things like medical pedigrees or the pandemics or the historical accounts of sicknesses in the kingdom. But on the bright side, we'd like to look that even though Hawaii had a very big population decline, and we see all these things in our research, all these different factors contributing, different pandemics, different diseases, conditions, societal structures that led to the decline of our people, all the Hawaiians who are living today, we are the survivors and the descendants of those survivors who went through all these turbulent times in order for us. And without them, we wouldn't be here today. So I think we have a certain level of obligation or kuleana to them, to learn more about them, to learn more about their lives and do our research in order to honor them and in order to respect their sacrifices and the lives and all these things and events that they had to go through, so we can be here today.
And on that note, I think keeping a medical pedigree for your own ohana, for your own selves, not just looking at medical pedigrees of other people, but taking note of sicknesses, of illnesses, diseases that you might have been a victim of, or that people before you and your family, their history of their sicknesses and diseases is really important for us to note. Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think has instilled this in us to be more cautious, to be more aware. And by taking note of these things and leaving this record of medical histories, medical pedigrees, really empowers the Hanauna Hikimayana or our descendants to come, so that they already may be aware of things that they might inherit, that they might be, that they may inherit, and then giving them that power to be preventative in their medical care and how they malawa themselves is really, I think, really important. So mahalo everyone, and we just want to say mahalo to everyone behind the scenes, mahalo to Hawaii Pono'i Coalition for having us, for inviting us back, and mahalo for everyone facilitating and doing the behind the scenes work. I think Le Maile is behind the scenes. Mahalo Le Maile for working everything, and mahalo all of you for listening to us and taking time to be here tonight.
So please, if you have any questions, now is the time. I see we have lots in the chat, but
we also have a question from Dr. Apoliona on Maui. Is there documentation of the physicians who attended the ali'i during their illnesses? And if so, do you find them to be helpful or not helpful?
This is a good question.
I think
you can start.
So in the case of Kalakaua, I think the circumstances of their deaths and where they were located had a role to play in the physicians and the amount of documentation. But actually in that article I read by McDermott et al., they actually said that because Kalakaua, while he was in Hawaii, he was a patient of Queen's Hospital, but there are no records of him being a patient. So actually in his life, he was fairly healthy. But the reason why they have all this information about his condition is because this person from America, the U.S. naval surgeon, George W. Wood, he took copious notes of the conditions of Kalakaua. So we were lucky in that sense that this certain doctor was, eleo, he was on it, and he wrote in detail about it. And I think the same in London for Lihoma, because they're in London and because London had newspapers, there were more information circulating about the circumstances of the death of the ali'i, and maybe not more so about those in Hawaii. And another thing too is because a lot of the information is in Hawaiian language, it's not really accessible to the majority of the general public today. So that's why it's important for these kinds of presentations when we can kind of ho'olaha, when we can kind of share out what we know about those kind of things. So mahalo for that question. You have anything to add?
Yeah, outside of the doctor's records, actually a lot of information can be found within the kahu or the reverends. So it's called Ali'i Letters Collection that actually contains the Hawaiian Evangelical Association that's under Hawaiian Mission Houses, one of their collections that's digitized or is being made digital pretty soon, all of them. Because the kahu see the ali'i and kind of they're traveling through a lot up and down the Pae'aina, and they make note of what they're seeing. So I know there was actually a report on Kauai Keaoli, he was actually thought to maybe have a stroke because one of the kahu on Hawaii Island writes to the kahu on Oahu Island that his right arm was paralyzed and his face was drooping down. So of course, you know, a lot of that is signs for a stroke. So that may be a reason or cause of his death. So looking at other letters available, not just from doctors, I think you can find medical information.
And all of those ali'i letters are available for you on Papakilo at the Papakilo database. So any of you folks can go take a look at that, actually. Mahalo for that question.
Great, mahalo nui. I know that there's a lot of real interest in this. There are tons of comments coming on Facebook and also in the chat here about how much we all have learned from your presentation and how deep and broad has been your research. So mahalo nui to Kahikino Kalā Domingo and Sage Leikuluwaimaka Meleiseā. We are going to close out the presentation, but I see your question, Noi, and if you can put that into the chat, we will make sure that we get it answered. We will answer it in writing. Mahalo nui to everybody. Yes, this will live on many Facebook pages, and it also, you can find it within a day or two, you'll find that it's on, it will be, this presentation and other ho'ola presentations will be archived on the HawaiianHistoryMonth.org website. So please go there for any of the presentations from last year, the year before, this one, and Dr. Titcomb's as well. Mahalo nui to both of you. Mahalo to our panelists. Mahalo earlier in the first session to Drs. Martina Kamaka and special presenter Dr. Carol Hi'ilani Titcomb. Mahalo to Leimai and to Courtney and all of our tech support. We have many sponsors here. Mahalo nui loa to Kamehameha Schools, the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, to Papaola Lokahi, to the John A. Burns School of Medicine's Department of Native Hawaiian Health, to Ahahui o Nakauka, the Association of Native Hawaiian Physicians. At UH Manoa, mahalo to the Center for Biographical Research, to Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, and to the Department of Theater and Dance. Also mahalo to the Hawaii Youth Opera Chorus, Olelo Community Media, and to OEV TV. And we have many partners who contributed to Hawaiian History Month throughout the entire month. And if you want to see more programming, either virtual or in person, please go to the website, HawaiianHistoryMonth.org, and register for the program that you want to participate in. Hawaiian History Month is proudly brought to you by the Hawaii Pono'i Coalition. Mahalo to all of you for tuning in. Eola.